Hello friends, this is Vashik Armenikus from Genius and Ink newsletter, and this is the very first voiceover of my article. The reason why I decided to create this voiceover to record it is because, first of all, this article is a bit too long. It will take approximately 20 minutes for you to read it. So I decided to make it more accessible to those of you who are too busy. Maybe you can listen to it whilst you're taking your work or falling asleep or doing chores around the house. I appreciate every second that you spend on listening, reading, or watching what I create. The second reason, however, why this article was voiced is because I wanted none of you to miss out on the message that it conveys. This is one of the most haunting pieces that I've ever written, and it doesn't involve any supernatural things. No ghosts, no UFOs, no other kind of haunting, scary things that you might have thought about. This is a very real, haunting, horrifying story that has a lot to teach to all of us. This article explores one of the most haunting paintings I've ever seen, and perhaps the most significant piece I've ever written. The story behind Géricault's The Raft of Medusa left me sleepless for many nights, ever since I wrote about it 4 years ago. I write to preserve the greatest stories I encounter in life. In books, films, paintings, or sculptures, stories are scattered all over the place, and it is so easy to forget them. Occasionally, I revisit my pieces to refine my writing skills, but at the same time to remind myself of the stories that captivated me at the time of writing. Yet, since I wrote about the raft 4 years ago, as I said, I've avoided revisiting it. It was really difficult to read this story about the human nature all over again, although I've written about it myself. The images of this horrifying story are too vivid, but as you will see, they still have a lesson to teach to those of us whose hearts are open to empathy. Despite of it being a horrifying story, I really hope that you will enjoy it, that you will see the lesson that it can teach to all of us. I would like to listen and hear your opinion in the comments down below. One last thing before we'll begin, I would like to say I'm no audible professional narrator. I might make mistakes, I might mispronounce words in French and in English as well. I might stumble upon some sentences, but I still hope that it will convey the atmosphere of the story better than an AI voiceover that you can get on Substack app. Once again, thank you for listening and watching and reading what I create, and this is the story of the Raft of Medusa. Géricault. What happens when you lose hope? Deconstructing the Raft of Medusa, a true tale of hope and despair, by Vashik Armenikus. Géricault allowed me to see his Raft of Medusa while he was still working on it. It made so tremendous an impression on me that when I came out of the studio, I started running like a madman and did not stop till I reached my own room. From the Diaries of Eugène Delacroix, 1817. Delacroix was not the only one who was driven close to madness by Géricault's painting. Since its creation, the Raft of Medusa instilled a fanatical and even religious devotion among its admirers. This is not surprising, since it is impossible not to go mad when you face the unimaginable horror that it depicts. Towards the catastrophe. In June 1816, a French frigate named Medusa, with 2 other ships in its convoy, departed from the French port of Rochefort. Medusa carried 400 people on board and was bound for the port of Saint-Louis in Senegal. The captain was Viscount de Chaumery, an aristocrat appointed to the position by King Louis XVIII, but who had not sailed in the last 20 years. In an attempt to make good time, de Chaumery decided to overtake two other ships, Echo and Argus, but due to his inexperience and poor navigation, the ship drifted 100 miles off its course. A day later, on the 2nd of July, de Chaumery ran Medusa aground off the coast of West Africa. Due to the lack of lifeboats on board, it was not possible to evacuate all 400 passengers at once. The plan was to make 2 trips to the shore and back. The supplies that remained on board were planned to be towed with the use of a small makeshift raft. Alexandre Corillard, a young engineer from Paris, started constructing the raft. It had to be strong enough to carry many barrels of wine, food, passengers' belongings, and no more than 10 people who would help steer while it was being towed. Not long after the construction of the raft, Corillard noticed that Medusa's bow was slowly beginning to collapse and leak. The fear among those who remained on board increased as the weather began to change and brought strong ocean waves which hit the doomed Medusa with increasing ferocity. This created a panic amongst the passengers who were considered to be low-ranking members of the ship, which included the soldiers, sailors, and Corillard himself. The spaces on the lifeboats were already taken by their superiors. Moreover, since the captain ordered to load the makeshift raft with the supplies first, the space on it was getting scarce as well. In fear of drowning, the remaining 147 passengers jumped on the small raft that was towed by the lifeboat. The raft went well beyond its capacity. Throwing some of the barrels and provisions overboard did free up some space. It did not decrease the weight of it quite enough. The panic among those on the raft increased, and some tried to jump on the lifeboat towing it. At that moment, the captain made the decision that later became a symbol and allegory of injustice. He cut the rope between the two vessels, sending the members of the low-ranking members of the ship of the raft adrift for 13 days. The bitter taste of despair. Insomnia drove the French painter Théodore Géricault mad after he read about the fate of the 147 people on board of the raft. Only 15 survived, and only 2 out of the 15 were willing to tell what happened afterwards. One of the 2 was the young engineer Alexandre Corillard himself. The year after the tragedy, Géricault met Corillard in the former's home, and some say he was mystified by the fact that Corillard was eating whole lemons whilst he recounted the events. Corillard's story was not one of hope and heroism, but of madness and despair. This went against the accepted notion that the intellectuals of France had at the time. French political philosophers portrayed the human nature as essentially good. They claimed that all existing evil was born from the corrupt institutions that spoil human nature. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains, said the French political philosopher Rousseau. But the story that Corillard told Géricault proved Rousseau's theories absolutely wrong. For the next 13 days, each passenger of the doomed raft fought for his own survival against everyone else. This was not the world of good-natured people that was described by Rousseau, but it was the world described by another, more pragmatic philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, who wrote that the condition of man is a condition of war of everyone against everyone. It took only 3 days since the Medusa ran aground for the first cases of cannibalism to occur on the raft. At first, they did not kill to eat. Only those who drowned were eaten. But it was not long after when the strong and healthy began to kill those who were weak and ill. When small mutinies threatened to leave no one alive on board, the passengers of the raft agreed to throw their weapons into the sea. But that did not help to avoid more deaths from violence. On the 11th day, fate mocked them cruelly. A butterfly flew next to the raft and then landed on a barrel. Those doomed passengers saw this as if God was communicating with them through nature. The butterfly reminded them of the biblical story of Noah, who received an olive branch in the beak of a dove after surviving the great flood. 2 days later, the raft was spotted by an English ship called Argus. Only 15 out of 147 people initially on board remained alive at that time. The English captain and his crew were so horrified by what they witnessed that some historians write the captain went insane months later after witnessing this. Géricault soon understood why Coréard was eating lemons in such large quantities. The acid taste of the fruit helped the young engineer to get rid of the foul taste of human flesh he devoured whilst on board that damned raft. The anatomy of the painting. Well, so which moment of this catastrophe did Géricault choose to draw? He could have drawn the moment when the Medusa struck the reef, or the moment the captain cut the tow ropes, or the murderous mutinies at night, or the moment when the butterfly landed on the raft. But he didn't. Instead, he chose the moment when the passengers of the raft saw the ship in the far distance. We might think that this is the moment when the English ship Argus rescued the doomed sailors of the raft. In truth, Argus did not initially notice the raft when it passed for the first time. It appeared on the horizon for half an hour, far but close enough for the members of the raft to see, and then disappeared. Géricault focused his work on this moment of sudden, intense hope, and then equally sudden and intense despair. Some believe it is still coming towards them, writes Julian Barnes in his book Keeping an Eye Open. Some are uncertain and waiting to see what happens. Some know that it is heading away from them, and that they will not be saved. This figure incites us to read the shipwreck as an image of hope being mocked. But the painting or any artwork that survives is the one that outlives its story. If Géricault wanted momentary fame at the risk of creating a political scandal, he could have drawn the moment of cutting the tow rope or the senseless or cannibalism that existed there, that happened there. He tried to explore the moment of human degradation. In the pursuit of realism, he visited his local morgue to observe the decaying dead bodies. There were rumors that he kept severed limbs and heads borrowed from the morgue in his art studio. He was a dandy and enjoyed attending meetings, parties, and social events. He decided to shave his head when he began to work on Medusa, to be too ashamed to attend those social gatherings and dedicate his attention solely to his work. He constructed the life-size raft in his study from instructions which he borrowed from Courreard, who constructed the original one. It is hard not to draw parallels between Géricault's approach to painting to that of Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was also a frequent visitor to hospitals in Florence, where he observed changes in the human body during their decay. When this masterpiece was first exhibited in the Paris Salon, it went under a different name, Scène de naufrage, French shipwreck scene. The name Medusa was not mentioned, but everyone who came to see this painting instantly understood which event Géricault referred to. Only 3 years had passed since the catastrophe, and the images of its horrors were still fresh in the public's mind. He chose this neutral title for his masterpiece because he wasn't looking for an ephemeral political scandal. He wanted to achieve immortality as an artist. When the King Louis XVIII saw the painting, he told Géricault, "Monsieur, Medusa was a disaster, but your painting is everything but that." Géricault saw an eternal theme that accompanies all of us throughout our lives, that of hope. To be able to fully express this, he introduced biblical elements that were used during the Renaissance into the neoclassical style popular at his time. We can also witness how he borrowed from the style of Michelangelo, particularly from the fresco The Last Judgment, which Michelangelo painted on the ceiling of Sistine Chapel. The scene resembles the one in Géricault's masterpiece. The naval painting was one of the subjects often depicted by the French masters at the time. Géricault was inspired particularly by a painting called The Shipwreck, drawn by a fellow Frenchman, the naval painter Claude-Joseph Vernet. Géricault borrowed and then improved on the techniques of his predecessors. In his work, he employed a technique called foreshortening, in which the painting appears to spill over the borders of its frame, which we can see at its bottom right. The foreshortening draws the viewer straight into action. It is as if the people on board the raft try to escape from the painting itself. We can see this in the naked dead passenger who is coming out of the frame of the painting on the right. Géricault constructs his story by employing two pyramidal elements. The mast, which makes part of the top of the pyramid, divides the passengers into two groups, those in despair on the left and those who persistently hold on the hope on the right. On the left, we can see an old man mourning with a young dead sailor lying on his lap. The old man that you see is Ugolino, a character from Dante's Divine Comedy. He was guilty of cannibalism and was placed in one of the most horrific circles of hell by Dante. The mast itself symbolizes the Christian cross. Those who we find on its left are people who got involved in sin, such as cannibalism, while those on the right side of it are those who did not lose their faith and hope to be rescued. We can see a man on the barrel who signals to the British vessel, which would soon disappear, as if to mock their hopes, but then return. Behind the man, we see their reactions to this hope. We see a red-haired man stretching his hands towards the horizon in an attempt to see the English ship, while completely ignoring the fact that someone has just bitten into his flesh. This is the final fight between life and death, hope and despair, sin and faith. This is when the weak try to drag the strong, and when the strong refuse to support the weak. We see a black-haired man trying to shrug off the hands of the dead who try to pull him towards the left, the doom side of the raft. We have heard of this man before. This is the man who said he had to run like a madman when he saw Géricault's painting. This is a French painter who will a decade later revolutionize art himself. This is Eugène Delacroix. How can one not become mad, at least temporarily, after looking carefully at this painting? From all the scenes that Géricault could choose, he undoubtedly chose the most meaningful, the most horrid, the most intense moment in this catastrophe. The amount of detail and research that he conducted makes his masterpiece one of the most realistic works in the history of art, and this is no exaggeration. Géricault did not leave any side of his work untouched or wasted. It can be read as a sentence in a book from left to right. If the right side of the raft is accompanied by the ship that inspires hope, the left side of the raft comes with a giant, powerful wave, which is about to shatter the raft's last remaining integrity and plunge everyone into the abyss. We are all on the Raft of Medusa. The most prominent of Géricault's biographers, Denise Aim Azam, wrote that Géricault hated his masterpiece. He wanted to cut it and destroy it, she said in 1993. He went mad after finishing it, but once on his deathbed, at the young age of 32, he asked his pupils to draw a small copy of his masterpiece and hang it in front of him. Aim Azam knew, as no one else, how difficult it is to write the biography of Géricault. The truth is that although he had a very rich life, he did not leave many records of his own thoughts. The only way for us to understand Géricault is through his paintings, and everyone interprets his works in their own way. There are 20 people depicted on board of Géricault's raft. They all, of course, differ: black or white, dead or alive, hopeful or in despair. But I believe these are not different, separate individuals, but they are only represent various stages and courses in the journey that we call life. We are all on the Raft of Medusa, said historian Jules Michelet, a contemporary of Géricault, when he saw the painting on display in Paris. This is why this painting instills a certain dose of madness in its admirers. I believe that is why Géricault, at the end of his life, came to terms with it and hung it in front of himself before he died. Because his masterpiece, in the words of the poet Arthur Rimbaud, represents that life is the farce we are all doomed and forced to endure. The end. I hope you enjoyed listening to my voiceover. Apologies for any stumbling mispronunciations both in French and English. I hope it made it accessible and enjoyable to listen to. I would really encourage those of you who heard and listened to this article to have a look at the pictures that I included in it. I believe the images in this article have a lot to explain. Please let me know what do you think about future voiceovers like this, and what do you think about this horrifying story. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next week. This was Genius and Ink and Vashik Armenikus.